Welcome to the Northern Business Podcast. Each week we talk to people active in business and the economy about the big issues driving growth in the north of England. We're sponsored by Virtue Motors, one of the UK's largest motor retailers. Check out its website at virtuemotors.com. I'm Graham Robb, owner of Recognition PR. We help scores of businesses promote their products and services, and some are featured on this podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today in the studio we have Helen Anderson, Head of Learning at the Thermal Insulation Contractors Association, the national training provider of thermal insulation, and down the line we have Steve Butler, Chief Executive of Punter Southall Aspire, a consultancy business that unites employee benefit consultancy, workplace savings and individual financial advice. And later, my colleague Josh Haverkin will be talking to Jason Oakes, who's Director at PHS Home Solutions and 0800 Repairs, and that's all about some of the innovations that are coming into heating homes in the UK as the government makes its mind up about how boilers and all sorts of other elements of home energy are dealt with. Right, well, let's start with both of you. Hello Helen, hello Steve. Steve,
Hi.
well,
Hello.
first of all, let's kick off. We talked about your consultancy, and we'll drill into what it does in a moment in terms of delivering advice on employee benefits and employees generally. But how are you finding the economy? I was looking at the latest data. We'll flash up the graph of real GDP growth according to the IMF. The international snapshot shows that the UK has had faster growth than any other European nation or many other European nations since 2010, and at the moment growth in the UK surprisingly is exceeding that of Germany. What's your sentiment and what's your experience?
I find that a bit of a surprise, actually. My clients are the HR directors and the HR team, and most of the challenge that they've faced over the last year is the cost of living crisis and how that's impacting their employees, how their employees are kind of managing, to keep themselves focused at work with the kind of financial distractions that they're experiencing, which, ultimately come off the back of Brexit and COVID, etc. And businesses have really struggled to grow through those periods. So I'm surprised that the GDP numbers look that good from the IMF.
My own client base, which is a basket of different clients, a large proportion of their biggest problem is recruiting because they have pipelines of work. So that their issue is they could grow if they could recruit, and albeit they are trying to deal with the challenge of wages and so on, there does seem to be a pipeline of work, and maybe that's a regional thing. Many of them are based in the north of England, and maybe a sector thing.
That could well be the case. Clearly, kind of recruitment and retention is on the agenda of every HR director, and it's an ongoing conversation that we have. So, obviously recruitment goes in spikes, and we've had quite a hot market over the last year or so. So I can see how that would impact growth potential.
Now, I first came across you by reading this article in the Sunday Times business section, and it was headlined "Battle Lines Drawn as 5 Generations Clash in the Office." And really this does go to recruitment and retention because it's about a peaceful, harmonious team working together. And I know you've written a book about this, which what's the title of the book? Mind the Gap?
Manage the Gap.
Manage the Gap.
Manage the Gap. So it's about the experiences I've had in my organisation of a multi-generational workforce and conflict that's arisen, and how I've gone about kind of managing that conflict. Clearly this is a live topic for every business at the moment, and it's a skill that managers have to learn. So it's something that we need to talk about, share best practice, etc. So that's what I was attempting to do with the book.
Now, the book is very interesting, and the Sunday Times recommends it as well, and I know you've written other books, which you feel free to mention. But let's talk about the experience that led you to write the book in the first place.
Yeah, I think so. My business is 150 people, and we span all ages from kind of 18 to 72. I think my eldest employee is. And over recent years, I saw more conflict arising in the workplace as as the millennial generation and Generation Z entered the workplace with different expectations about what they're expecting when they arrived, and that kind of led to conflict, and I've had to go about managing those issues.
Okay, we'll talk about how you manage them in a moment, but let's dissect the actual generations. We'll flash a slide up to remind people what the generations are, and we can talk through some of the analysis that maybe you'd give of what you feel might be the expectations or the attitude of that generation in the workplace. Let's go to the oldest generation first, people that were born between 1928 and 1945. Now, not that many of them in the workplace now, but they're called the silent generation. What's the attitude?
The silent generation and the baby boomer generation often groups together. Very compliant. They've grown up in a world where they work 9 to 5. They wore suits to work. They worked in organisations with hierarchy, and they respected their bosses and didn't challenge. And that's what they've grown up with, and that's kind of how they expect work to be. So certainly when they experience people wanting to wear, not suits to work, or not work 9 to 5, or not be in the office all the time, they're kind of surprised at that reaction because they think that's the way it should be.
I get that. I am of that generation because I was born in 1964. I know I don't look that old, I know. But 1964, that makes me the very tail end of the boomer generation. I still do wear a suit to work. You should hear the soundtrack in my car, by the way. My daughters pick on me. It's boomer music, folks. It's boomer music. This element of compliance, the other element is that there's an element of not clock watching, careers and so on being very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, before we kind of get into too much detail about the different generations, referring to people by Generation Z or Baby Boomer over recent years has caused a lot of conflict by virtue of the titles themselves, because people are stereotyped for being a certain way, and clearly we are all very different, and you can't just group people by when they were born. So one of the things that I propose in my book is it's experiences that shape the way that people behave, and the biggest fundamental experience that has divided the generations has been those that have grown up with the internet and all that's brought with it, and those that haven't. And I think that for me that's the big divide. So rather than talking about Boomer and X and Y and Z, etc., throughout the book I talk about a younger cohort and an older cohort that are divided by this experience of the internet. And I think just to build on that further, if you grew up your whole life with the internet, with social media, with iPhones, etc., the way that you communicate is very different from someone that hasn't. To the very simple point that if you grew up without it, you were taught that when you spoke to someone, you had to look at them and give them eye contact. If you grown up with all this technology around you, you're very used to multitasking and texting someone at the same time you're talking to someone, and some of those things that an older generation might treat as respect or expect as respect are not expected from that younger generation, and that's potentially where some of the conflict issues arise.
So that's a very interesting point, and something I've experienced this week in my own office, actually, Steve, because we have it's only a small office of 12, 15 people. At the moment, there are 12 people because of holidays, and there's a young man who's come in who's 17 years old, born when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and one of his jobs is to answer the phone, and we've trained him in how to answer the phone, but it's something that he was not comfortable with because he said to me, and this was a revelation to me, this is about me learning, not him, when he normally answers the phone, it's on his mobile, and his mobile tells him who's ringing. But then to ask him to answer the phone in a busy office where he doesn't know who's ringing, and to affect a smile, and that is actually something I didn't realise I had to not expect but teach.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, I have a whole cohort of people that that treats sales in usually every other tool apart from the telephone. But I grew up in a world where sales you did on the telephone by phoning someone up and telling them about your services. So it's changed the way we work quite dramatically.
Do you think there's any change in your experience of people who've come into the workplace very recently, post-pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is another one of the challenges that, one of the problems of the pandemic, or benefits of the pandemic, is we've moved to a hybrid working world, which is great for someone like me who's had a whole career of being in the office and collaborating with colleagues, etc. And someone new joining the workplace who only comes in once a week or twice a week is missing out on that collaboration and kind of learning experience. So often they don't have the confidence to ask or to want to ask how they do things, etc. So that led to perhaps lower productivity when they join the business, because they're spending more time learning because they're not in the office straight away, which again creates a view on how well someone's doing or not in the business, which is not their own fault.
And also
they're perhaps sat at home not knowing what to do.
And also, not everyone you need to ask is in the office.
Exactly.
I mean, we have a full office in our business. We work from the office, and our young guy who's an intern, by the way, a paid intern. I never, ever don't give interns no wage. They always have a wage at my firm. And the way in which someone should treat an intern is to treat it as a learning experience, isn't it? The millennial generation is the one that people of my age and maybe of yours have traditionally had a bit of fun with, the snowflake labels and so on. But is there a way of understanding that cohort of people and how they are reacting, both in technology terms and, unlike my generation, they are coming into a time that buying a house is more difficult, that they may have large student debt, which I wasn't saddled with when I started in the workplace. Perhaps an understanding of that is important as well.
Yeah, and in fact, this is the largest generation in the workplace now, and they're now of an age in their 30s that they're in kind of management roles. So they're the really dominant force in the workplace now, and their view of the world is important. And I think for me, one of the observations that I made is my older cohort of people kept their personal life and their business life very separate. If they had friends at work, they'd tell them about their personal life, but they wouldn't broadcast their personal life in the office. They kept the two very separate. Now, the younger cohort, the millennials and Gen Zs, grown up with technology, grown up with social media, Instagram, they're constantly sharing. And they see the world very integrated between their personal life and their business life. So it's perfectly reasonable for them to say, well, I'm dropping out the office for a couple of hours to go and see a friend because I'll make up the hours in the evening. And they will make up the hours in the evening. But for someone that's always worked 9 to 5 and has never blended their work and their personal life together, they find that challenging. And again, another area where conflict arises. Having said all of that, why shouldn't we all have the flexibility to kind of drop in and out of work as required, stop work to go and pick the children up from school and make up the hours later? As organizations, we should really be focused on productivity, not hours kept, which was perhaps the historical way of kind of measuring productivity. So there's lots of positive stuff that comes out of this new generation entering the workplace and the way that they work, but we all have to understand it and understand what the benefits of each way of working is.
Lastly, I just want to ask you about a prevalence in business that I think probably is driven by generational and attitudinal thinking, and that is towards ethics, ESG and so on. There's a big row that's happened this week. We're recording and presenting this on the day that the chief executive of NatWest has resigned. And she has resigned ostensibly over a very narrow point of client confidentiality, but that narrow point of client confidentiality was born of an ESG attitude to compliance, where a group of compliance officers had compiled data on a client of a bank, namely Nigel Farage, and there was an attitude and approach to ethics that on one side of the coin you could argue demonstrated overreach and intolerance, and on another side of the coin demonstrated a willingness to assert a certain set of ethical values into an organisation's bloodstream. How does that mix up with the way in which we have a mixed workforce now?
Yeah, it's really interesting because my younger cohort join the workplace and they want the business to have a set of values that are aligned to their own. And often, we'll recruit people and what the business thinks and what the individual thinks aren't aligned, and that individual won't stay very long. It's really important to this younger generation. Whereas I think my older cohort of employees have a different approach. They're coming to work to earn a wage, and if the values aren't quite aligned, it's not such a problem. So I think as organizations, as workplaces, we need to think really carefully about what our values are and embed them into the organization. I think in the example that you're talking about, the whole foundation of banking is based on trust. So if the person at the top cannot be trusted to keep things confidential, then the whole fabric of the bank doesn't work. So regardless of the values of the bank, I believe, ultimately she kind of breached a level of trust that someone in her position should have known better.
Absolutely. I completely agree to that with that assessment. It's been fascinating talking to you. Do stay on the line, Steve. I should point out to our viewers that although you are personally based in London, your consultancy has an office in York, so we're a Northern Business podcast, and what you're doing also applies to Northern businesses.
Absolutely. We even go as far as Scotland. We're a kind of national business with people all over.
Excellent. Right, so that's Steve Butler, and joining me is Helen Anderson. Helen, what did you make of what he said in your role at the Thermal Insulation Contractors Association?
Yeah, really interesting. I think particularly what resonated with me was your comment about the kind of this hybrid working from home, working from the office. And I think something I've noticed through my own experience is although there's kind of positives, negatives to both, I think where the completely remote working really impacts is with those new starts. And it's not even about even if they don't need to ask direct questions, I think there's so much you pick up from the office environment through osmosis, from hearing other people's conversations, from just understanding kind of the context of a business, and you really don't get a lot of that from home. So I think there is a place for both, but for new starters, we work a 4-day week from the office and a day from home, and that's most of us, and that's a really good kind of mix for us.
Of course, working from home doesn't apply to a number of your trainees. Tell us the job you have at TICA and what kind of market you're in.
Yeah, so I was brought in. TICA wear a lot of hats, but the hat that most impacts on my job role is our role as the training provider. So we're the training provider, or the college, if you like, that deliver all apprenticeship training for level 2 and level 3 apprentices. And when we talk about thermal insulation, we're not talking about kind of domestic dwellings. We're talking about engineering sites. We're talking about commercial sites. Think schools, colleges, hospitals, power stations. All of those buildings will have pipework, so we're training those apprentices. So those apprentices come to us to learn their kind of practical skills, and then they go back to site and they hone those skills. So none of that can be done from home. All of it's done very much face to face, and it's interesting talking about this growth in the economy, because what I can say about the thermal insulation industry at the moment, although it might not be kind of mirrored in the rest of construction, thermal insulation really is booming. We've taken more apprentices this year than we've taken in the last 3 years. Obviously some of that will be an impact of COVID, but yeah, we've seen a real kind of increase in the number of apprentices we're taking on.
And we think about the kind of people that use materials that need to be insulated, pipes and processes that need this kind of high level insulation. They'll need it for safety. Yep. They'll need it for environmental reasons.
Absolutely.
And they will need it because there is a general renewal of this kind of infrastructure, isn't there? As petrochemical gives way to hydrogen production, and particularly in the north of England where we have large process industries, there is at the moment an ongoing renewal of those industries.
Absolutely. We were at a visit yesterday at Tees Works, talking about all the projects they've got going on there, and obviously there's loads in terms of
I have to give a full disclosure. I'm on the board of Tees Works. Now, I didn't know that when you said that.
Yeah, so yeah, really interesting what they're trying to achieve there and all the jobs that's going to bring to the local industry. And I think what we're trying to work out at the moment is how we fit into that. But you're right, a lot of it is about not just kind of new builds for thermal insulation. It's a lot about kind of retrofit and how we deal with sort of embodied carbon in a lot of existing buildings and how we make them work as energy efficiently as they possibly can.
We had the government looking at the net zero agenda. From memory, what was said this week is the Prime Minister said he was definitely committed to net zero and the legal definition and objective of it. But Michael Gove, on domestic settings, is trying to stop people having to automatically retrofit boilers in 12 years' time and maybe alleviate some of the costs on domestic landlords. Does that impact on you in any way?
Only in the sense that, I mean, individual domestic dwellings is something that would be kind of covered by a plumber on a much more kind of local domestic scale. But I think there's been kind of quite a few issues with a lot of things around heating in homes, the alternatives to gas boilers. There's a lot of kind of challenges to iron out there. On the more kind of commercial industrial setting, you know, we deal with apprentices that might be going onto sites where heat networks are created for things like flats, and it's really kind of crucial there that everything's working properly, and we're training people with the skills to kind of insulate those pipes to get them working efficiently and provide the energy that's needed. And
finally, you've got a project, I think it's based in the East Midlands, but you're putting a definitive effort into recruitment of female trainees. Tell us about that and whether you're having any success.
Yeah, that's right. So it's been a bit of a leap of faith, and I think it comes really from the fact that what our members and our employers are telling us is that there is a skill shortage. It's really obvious. Something that we've done quite a lot of analysis on is how many of our workforce are leaving the industry over the next 15 years. So we've got, as with construction more generally, we've got an ageing population. So over the next 10 to 15 years, 30% of the thermal insulation industry will retire. So that's huge. So we've got to fill that gap. We don't think we can always fill that gap with males. If you think of things about like how many people every year are going to university, how many people end up joining things like the NHS, your pool of people gets smaller and smaller. And we haven't really ever kind of promoted it with women specifically. And if you look at society and you look at policies and legal systems, everything's in place now that in theory, women have as much access to construction. But where are they? Because none of them are on site.
Well, let's talk to our resident expert today. Yeah. I'm sorry, Steve, I'm going to place you on the spot now. You've looked at different generations in the workplace. What about different generations and different genders' attitude to different types of employment? Does everyone want to be in PR or to be in movies or the media, or is the attraction of hands-on blue-collar jobs likely to come back into fashion, particularly as they're very well paid?
Extremely well paid, yeah.
Wow, what a question. I don't know
whether
I can answer that, but I do think, you know, we often talk about kind of ageism and how older individuals are treated. But, you know, there's a concept now of gendered ageism, in that how women are treated because of their age. And I think what we see is that women are consistently treated different throughout their career, regardless of their age. You know, they're treated as a younger individual, they haven't got enough experience. As a mid-career individual, you know, they're not quite right for whatever reason, because they're taking career breaks or kind of menopause or whatever, and then later in career they're experiencing the same ageism that men are. So it's clearly really challenging for kind of women in the workplace, in the society that we live in. So I think initiatives like this are really important because they kind of break down those gender stereotypes, and ultimately that's what will remove the poor treatment that we see in the workplace.
Definitely, and I think a key thing for us has been, you know, like I said, in theory that the playing field has been levelled. However, for us, it's about going above and beyond now. So what opportunities can we create for women that make it even more accessible than it might be for their counterparts? And that's what the Nottingham pilot's about. And we started with Nottingham purely because we've got a couple of employers there that were really interested in taking this on. But, you know, next step is the rest of the world and the rest of the UK. So it will be coming to the north as well if it's successful. And we're really kind of hoping it will be. There's a lot going on to kind of ensure that we're getting some candidates interested in it.
Well, look, Helen, Steve, you're both first-time guests on the Northern Business Podcast. It's been a fascinating discussion. I hope you both come back in the next season. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, let's talk to my colleague, Josh Haverkin. Let's see who he's speaking to today.
Thanks, Graham. This week, Michael Gove, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, has been talking about potentially slowing the phase out of natural gas boilers. This is to provide more time for investment in infrastructure and also for a better, more cost-effective transition to net zero. Today, I'm joined by Jason Oakes, Sales Director at PHS Home Solutions and 0800 Repair. It's one of the UK's leading suppliers and installers of heat pumps, installation and boilers. So there really couldn't be a better person on the podcast to talk to us about this today. Jason, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So what have you thought of what Mr. Gore's been saying? What parts have really spoken to you?
Yeah, it's really interesting comments over the weekend. I'll just start by my experience of with 15 years within the renewable sector, designing and installing renewable technologies and heat pumps. But you know, we're very fully supportive of the government's carbon agenda, and you know that's what we've been doing for a long time. But it's interesting, and sometimes you've got to appreciate where the country is at the minute, and obviously the financial side of things. So this fuel deprivation and the cost of the renewable technologies to upgrade on properties at the minute is quite costly and quite expensive. So looking back to what Michael said over the weekend, there's a lot of things that need to be implemented, and the angle he could be looking at is because of the fabric of the buildings needs to be improved.
That's
and what
installation
else can you do?
for our listeners, isn't it?
Yeah,
In layman's
absolutely.
terms,
So
yeah.
yeah, insulate that box as much as possible. Therefore, the heating solution is reduced in the demand. So it's a cost-effective measure on that side.
Okay, so what he's been saying is that, or one of the things he's been saying is that getting the EPC level to C for landlords is too costly at the moment, and trying to get those gas boilers out and replaced with green technologies, the cost is too onerous on the property owner at the moment. Do you think that's quite right?
Yeah, with what's going on with the interest rates and the cost of living side of things, some of the rented, obviously the people, the tenants, could be struggling. Therefore, could affect the landlords effectively. But we've got an obligation to meet EPC Band C by 2028. Is it? Is that the right time to do it? Yeah, we could be. There's a great shortage of engineers, skilled labour on insulation measures and heat pump renewable installers, PV installers, and so it's 600 heat pumps per year. That's what the government's devoted to. Well, we're going to do that. We're trying our hardest, but the reality is that we haven't got the correct labour force and training in place at the minute to hit them targets. So you might be coming from that angle where the skill factor is not there to deliver it at the minute.
So from your perspective, it's partially financially and also a labour issue, that there's not the skills, qualifications and experience out there to hit that target. By stretching it out and increasing the time of the phase out, it gives you a bit more time to get the right infrastructure and skills in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've been fortunate. We implemented our training facilities where all of our engineers dual skill effectively across the board that can transition from gas installers to renewable installers quite easily. But yeah, there's a huge cost behind that as well, and it's cost us a lot of money, but we've invested in it, and now we install huge amounts of renewables and insulation measures and fabric side of things for external wall, internal wall, roof insulation, underfloor heating side of things, and that's our primary focus, to make that that building is insulated as possible So the home order tenant effectively, the bills are reduced. It doesn't have to focus on the heat side of it, heat generation, but once you get the tariff correct for the heat pump by having PV panels and batteries, or being smart on your tariff ratings, and you've got a fantastic system within the building.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Jason. We're going to go back to Graham now in the studio.
Thanks, Joss. Now, if you'd like to join us as a guest on the Northern Business Podcast, I'll be tagging in my colleagues on LinkedIn, so feel free to get in touch. We'd love to hear from you via LinkedIn, me, Graham Robb, and it's at Graham Robb on LinkedIn. Now we're going to take a break for the summer. Do join us on a return, which is the 13th of September, and we'll be joined by the economist Julian Jessup and the co-founder of Power Sheds, Jack Sutcliffe. Never miss an episode. Like, rate and subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.